The moment my son handed me that envelope, I remember thinking, finally he sees me. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things that winter. My name is Edward, I'm 68 years old, and I spent 41 years working as a licensed electrician out of Sudbury, Ontario. I'm not a complicated man. I like my morning coffee black, I like hockey, and I like knowing where I stand with people. That last one, that's where I got into trouble. My wife passed 11 years ago. Breast cancer, caught too late. After she died, I sold the house on Spruce Street where we'd raised our kids and moved into a smaller place on the edge of town. 2 bedrooms. A yard I could actually manage on my own. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was adapting. What I didn't understand then was that the moment I sold that house, something shifted in how my son looked at me. I didn't see it. Not for years. My son is 42. He married a woman I'll call his wife, because that's what she is to me now. A role, not a person I know. They live in Barrie, about a 4-hour drive south. Nice house, 2 incomes, no children. They always seemed comfortable. More than comfortable, honestly. They took trips to Portugal, renovated their kitchen twice, drove matching SUVs. I never asked where the money came from. It wasn't my business. I helped when I could. When they bought their first condo in 2014, I gave them $40,000. I told my son it was a gift, not a loan. He said thank you once, and we never talked about it again. When the roof on the condo started leaking 3 years later, I drove down and fixed it myself. It took me a weekend. I didn't charge him. I didn't think I had to. That's the part that's hard to explain to people, how ordinary it all felt, how none of it seemed like a pattern, until I was standing in an airport parking lot in February with a one-way ticket in my hand and my phone going to voicemail. Let me back up. Last November, my son called me on a Sunday evening. He sounded warm, almost excited. He said he'd been thinking about me, said he was worried I was isolating too much since I'd retired. He wasn't wrong about that. The winters in Sudbury are long, and after I stopped working, the days had started bleeding together in a way I didn't love. He asked if I'd ever considered a cruise. I told him I hadn't, not really. He said he'd been reading about these repositioning cruises, ships that sail from one port to another as they change routes between seasons. He said he'd found a good deal on one leaving from Halifax, going down through the eastern seaboard, ending in Fort Lauderdale. 10 days. He said he wanted to book it for me as a late Christmas gift. Give me some sun, some time to breathe, some space to just enjoy myself for once. I said it sounded nice. He said he'd handle everything. He booked it. Sent me the confirmation by email. I'm not much for reading the fine print on things like that. I figured a ticket was a ticket. I printed it out, folded it into my coat pocket, and started thinking about what to pack. I bought a new pair of walking shoes. I got one of those packing cubes from the Canadian Tire on Paris Street. I was looking forward to it, if I'm being honest. More than I'd looked forward to anything in a while. I drove to Halifax in early February, booked a room at a motel near the port for the night before, had a meal at a diner by myself, fish chowder, brown bread, the kind of thing they do right in Nova Scotia. I slept well. In the morning, I got up early, had coffee, drove to the terminal. That's where it started to come apart. I was standing at the check-in counter when the woman behind the desk looked at my booking and paused. One of those pauses that people try to make look like nothing. She typed something, looked at her screen, typed again. She asked me if I'd be arranging my return travel from Fort Lauderdale separately. I told her I assumed there was a return leg included. She turned her monitor slightly toward me and showed me the booking. One way, Halifax to Fort Lauderdale. I stood there for a moment. I thought there must have been a mistake. I called my son right there at the counter. No answer. I called his wife. No answer. I left messages for both of them, calm messages, the kind you leave when you're sure there's been a simple mix-up. I thanked the woman at the desk, took my bag, and walked outside to the parking lot. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes. I'm not a man who panics. I've been in tight spaces before. I've had live wires come loose in my hands. I've had scaffolding give out under me. You learn to get very still and very clear when something goes wrong. So I got still. I thought about what I actually knew. I had a ticket. I had my bags. I had enough cash and a credit card. I had 10 days ahead of me on a ship. And I had 10 days ahead of me on a ship. And I had a feeling I couldn't quite name yet, something cold at the back of my throat. I decided to board. The ship was called the Atlantic Meridian. It was bigger than I expected. 13 decks, over 2,000 passengers. My cabin was small but clean. Porthole window, single bed. Enough space to move around. I unpacked slowly, organized my things, went up to the main deck to watch them cast off. The harbor was gray and flat, and Halifax looked the way it always does in February. Stoic, a little frozen, quietly beautiful. I watched until the city disappeared. I didn't sleep well the first night. By the second morning, I'd started to think more carefully. My son still hadn't called back. His wife hadn't called back. That was unusual. I sent a text. Simple, no accusation in it. Just asking about the return ticket. Red receipts showed he'd seen it. No reply came. I went to breakfast in the main dining room and sat at a table for two near the window. The man across from me was alone as well. He was maybe 70, white-haired, heavy-set in the comfortable way that some men get at that age. He had a Globe and Mail crossword folded in half next to his coffee cup. We nodded at each other the way Canadians do, acknowledging without imposing. His name was Clifton. He'd been taking cruises for 12 years, ever since his wife had suggested they try one, and then passed away 3 months before their first booking. He'd gone alone, he said, because he didn't know what else to do with the reservation. And he kept going back. He said the ocean was the one place where he never felt the urge to explain himself to anyone. I liked him immediately. Careful, unhurried, a bit dry. He reminded me of the foremen I used to respect, the ones who didn't raise their voices because they never needed to. I told him about the ticket on the third day. I don't know why I told him. I hadn't planned to. We were sitting in the enclosed observation lounge watching the coast of Maine go by, and he asked what had brought me on a winter crossing. And I heard myself say it plainly. My son booked me a one-way ticket, and he won't return my calls. Clifton set down his coffee. He looked at me for a moment in that steady way of his. He didn't say, "I'm sure it's nothing." He didn't say, "Maybe there's an explanation." He said, "Do you have a financial advisor?" I told him I'd been managing my own RRSP and a small TFSA through my credit union. He said, "Is your son listed anywhere on those accounts?" He wasn't. But the question sat in my chest like a stone. That afternoon, I thought about the things I'd been putting off for a while. I'd been meaning to update my will. My current will, made in 2009, left everything to my wife. It had never been properly revised after she died. I knew I needed to deal with it. My son knew it too. We talked about it loosely, the way families talk about these things. Vaguely, without urgency, the way you talk about things you assume you'll have time for. I started going through my memory carefully. 6 months ago, my son had started calling more often than usual. I mean, before that we talked maybe twice a month. He'd started mentioning my estate planning in passing. He'd suggested gently that I might want to talk to a lawyer, and offered to help me find one. A couple of months ago, he'd asked me to sign some documents related to a power of attorney arrangement. He'd framed it as responsible planning, said it would make things easier if anything ever happened to me. I'd signed them. I didn't read them carefully enough. I trusted him. Clifton listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I worked in estate law for 30 years before I retired. Do you remember the name of the law firm that prepared those documents?" I did. I'd kept a copy in my email. We went to his cabin because he had a laptop. He helped me locate the firm online. It was a real firm based in Barrie. But when he looked carefully at the structure of what I had described, the power of attorney, the timing, the one-way ticket, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Edward, I think someone is trying to take a very long shortcut. He meant they didn't need me dead. They just needed me gone, long enough to have me declared incapacitated, or to have documents filed, or to access accounts before I could object. I didn't fully understand all of it then. I didn't want to, but I understood enough. I called my credit union from the ship's satellite phone the next morning. I told him I was traveling. I had concerns about account access, and I wanted to place a verbal hold on any transactions over $500 pending my written confirmation. The woman on the phone was patient and professional. She said she could flag the accounts and follow up with me by email. I gave her my personal email address, not the one my son knew about, an old Hotmail I'd had since 2003 that I barely used. An email came back within 2 hours. There had been an inquiry on my accounts 9 days earlier. Not a transaction. An inquiry. Someone had called and asked about the process for adding a secondary account holder in the event of incapacitation. I sat with that for a long time. Clifton had a contact, a former colleague, a solicitor in Toronto who still practiced. He helped me draft an email to her from his laptop. I explained the situation, attached the power of attorney documents I'd forwarded to myself, and asked for an urgent review. She responded by the following morning. The documents were real, she said, but there were errors in how they'd been witnessed. Specifically, the witness signatures didn't meet Ontario's requirements for a continuing power of attorney for property. They could be challenged. More than that, she said. If I was willing to act quickly, I could revoke them entirely and file new documentation before they were ever used. She sent me the revocation form by email. Clifton printed it from the ship's business center. I signed it, he witnessed it. We had it notarized by the ship's purser, which is apparently a thing that can be done. Clifton knew this. Clifton knew a lot of things. We sent the signed revocation by courier from our next port, which was Boston. I also called a different lawyer that day, one I found myself, through the Law Society of Ontario's referral line. I explained that I needed to update my will urgently. She offered a video call from her office. We did it from the ship's business center as well. I won't go into the details of what I changed, but I will say this. My son's name remained in my will. The terms, however, are now very different. On day 7 of the cruise docked in Savannah, Georgia, I finally heard from my son. He texted, not called. He said he was sorry he'd been so out of touch. Things had been busy at work. He hoped I was having a wonderful time. He said he'd been thinking about me and wanted to talk when I got back. He asked, and I noticed the phrasing, whether I'd thought any more about getting my affairs in order. I read that text 3 times. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went for a walk along the riverfront with Clifton. We bought pecan brittle from a street vendor. We didn't talk about my son. We talked about Savannah, about the architecture, about the Spanish moss hanging from the trees. It was a good afternoon. That night, I replied to my son's text. I said I was having a wonderful trip. I said I'd be home soon. I didn't mention the lawyer or the credit union or the revocation. I didn't mention Clifton. I just said, I've been doing a lot of thinking, too. We'll talk when I get back. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already arranged a return flight. Booked it myself. WestJet, Fort Lauderdale, to Toronto, connecting to Sudbury. Paid for it with my own credit card. I had a seat assignment and everything. Before I left the ship in Fort Lauderdale, Clifton and I had breakfast together one last time. He had eggs Benedict. I had the same, though I'm not usually a brunch person. We exchanged phone numbers and email addresses. He lives in Victoria, BC, which is about as far from Sudbury as you can get and still be in Canada. But he said he comes east in the summers sometimes, and I said I'd look forward to that. He said something as we were saying goodbye that I've thought about many times since. He said, "The law isn't sentimental, Edward, but it is patient, and it always favors the man who got there first." I flew home on a Thursday. On the Friday, I drove down to Barrie. My son opened the door. He looked surprised to see me. Not just surprised, a different kind of surprised. The color went out of his face in a specific way. His wife appeared behind him, and she had the same look. That look is something I'll carry with me for a long time. Not because it hurt me, but because it told me everything I've been trying not to believe. I didn't raise my voice. I sat down at their kitchen table, the nice table, the one they'd bought with their second kitchen renovation, and I put three things down in front of him. The power of attorney revocation, stamped and filed, a letter from my solicitor, outlining my concerns and advising him to seek independent legal counsel, and a copy of my updated will, just the cover page, with a date on it clearly visible. I said, I love you. I've always loved you, and I hope one day you'll be able to explain to me what you were thinking. But I'm telling you right now, whatever you thought was going to happen, it isn't going to happen that way. He tried to talk. His wife tried to talk. I listened for a while. There were explanations that didn't hold together, and apologies that came out sideways, and at one point his wife said something about how they'd only been trying to protect me, and I said quietly that I'd been protecting myself since 1979, and I wasn't planning to stop. I drove back to Sudbury that evening. Stopped at a Tim Hortons somewhere north of Barrie, had a coffee and a maple dip, sat in the parking lot for a little while. The sky was doing that thing it does in February in Ontario, where it's not quite dark, but it's not light either, and everything is just blue and still. I thought about my wife. I thought about the house on Spruce Street. I thought about 41 years of getting up early and doing honest work, and trusting that the people I loved understood what that meant. Then I drove the rest of the way home. The legal situation is still being sorted out. My solicitor says the power of attorney filing was irregular enough that there's a case to be made if I want to pursue it. I'm still deciding. There are days when I want to, and days when I think about my son as a child, 7 years old, helping me carry tools up from the basement, asking me how everything worked, and I think maybe what I've already done is enough. Clifton called me last week. He's planning a trip to Muskoka in July. First time he's been to Ontario in several years. I told him he could stay in my spare room if he wanted to. He said he'd think about it. I suspect he will. My accounts are locked down properly now. My will says what I mean it to say. My name's the only one on anything that matters. And I'm still here. Still in Sudbury. Still drinking my coffee black. Still watching the hockey. Still standing. I've been sitting with this for a few months now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand. Not to do anything with it, just to understand the weight of it. What happened to me on that cruise wasn't a surprise attack. That's the part I keep coming back to. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, patient, and carefully arranged. And I missed it. Not because I was foolish, but because I was trusting. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to stop blaming myself for not seeing it sooner. Here's what I've come to understand. The choices my son made didn't begin with a one-way ticket. They began much earlier, in small decisions. The first time he took without asking. The first time he deflected instead of answered. The first time he looked at what I'd built over 40 years and saw a number instead of a life. Those early choices shaped everything that came after, not because some force in the universe was keeping score, but because character is built the same way a house is built, one decision at a time, on top of the last one. By the time that ticket was booked, he'd already been building toward it for years. I just hadn't been reading the blueprints, and I made choices too. I chose to give without conditions. I chose to trust without verifying. I chose for a long time to interpret silence as busyness and vagueness as personality. Those were my decisions, and they had consequences. I'm not saying I caused what he did. I didn't. What he did was his. But I've had to be honest with myself about the habits I had that made things easier for him than they should have been. That kind of honesty is uncomfortable. It's also the only kind worth having. What saved me wasn't luck, though Clifton appearing at that breakfast table certainly felt like it. What saved me was that when the moment came, I got quiet and I got clear. I didn't react with anger. I didn't confront anyone before I was ready. I thought carefully about what I actually knew versus what I feared, and I acted on the facts. That's not something you can do in a panic. It's something you have to have practiced, even without knowing you are practicing it. In every job where something went wrong and you had to stay calm, in every difficult conversation where you chose precision over volume. Clifton said the law favors the man who got there first. I think life works the same way, not in a competitive sense, but in the sense that the person who shows up prepared, who has done the quiet, unglamorous work of knowing their own situation, is the one who has options when things go sideways. I think about what I'd say to someone who's in the early version of where I was. Someone who has a feeling they can't quite name, a pattern they haven't let themselves look at directly yet. I'd say, look at it. Name it, not because it will be easy, but because the cost of not looking is always higher. Your clarity is the one thing no one can file paperwork against. I still love my son. That hasn't changed, and I don't expect it to. But love without boundaries isn't love. It's an open door, and some people will walk through it carrying things they have no right to take. Knowing that isn't bitterness. It's just something I understand now that I didn't understand before. I'm 68 years old. I'm still here, and I know exactly where I stand.